Once my wife and I pulled up to a traffic light in broad daylight and two guys smashed the car window to steal our belongings. The police were driving by and they started shooting. Everybody in South Africa knows somebody who has been a victim of violent crime. 58 people are murdered every day on average. Here are 10 things that are not normal about life in South Africa and how we can make it better. 1. Some people are ready for violence. There was recent protests and looting in some South African cities. And there's credible allegations that the unrest was sparked by political factions. But in other countries around the world, it would be incredibly difficult to mobilize thousands of people to loot about 200 shopping centers and for over 300 people to lose their lives unless the people are already pissed off. It's like this dry firewood that's been collecting for a long time, and when that happens, it's really easy to light the match. It was initially sparked by former President Jacob Zuma going to prison for contempt of court. He's facing corruption charges.
Zuma is like Jesus, but Zuma is nothing like Jesus. But Jesus died for our sins. Zuma is also dying for the sins of a black person.
Zuma good for women? Is he good for
everyone? For everyone!
And while the unrest started as a political thing, it also became opportunistic crime and looting by some. The thing is, in societies that have good education and jobs, that kind of crime tends not to happen. South Africa is deeply broken, and it's important to remember that, too, violent protests are not new. How about Marikana, where 34 miners were shot dead by police? They were protesting for higher wages. Or the xenophobic uprisings, when foreign nationals were set on fire with burning tires. Or what about the poo wars, when people were so tired of waiting for proper toilets that they poured human shit at Cape Town International Airport. So why is all this happening? Because point 3, South Africa is the most unequal country in the world. The thing is, it's sometimes difficult to see the inequality on the ground. A buddy of mine, Johnny Miller, flew a drone above South African skies to see the bigger picture. One side has lush suburbs, green grass and swimming pools, and the other is informal settlements and tin shacks. I moved to the township of Soweto in 2012 to try and see life on the other side. I learned a lot in Soweto. I had rats running over my corrugated iron roof, and I got robbed on my first day. Crime is across all South African communities. One thing that really surprised me was the cost of transport. Even though I was squeezed into a minibus taxi with like 16 people, it's incredibly expensive. And that's because townships are so far away from the major cities. Far enough to keep people away, but close enough so they come into work. In fact, many black South Africans can't commute to work because it's too far. And that leads to point number 4, migrant labor. When you look at mine workers, domestic workers, farm workers, they're often living really far away from their families. And that means young kids are growing up without their mothers and fathers to help them with their schooling, their education, their upbringing, and they're being raised by their grandparents. Can you imagine not having your nuclear family around? In fact, if you've got a domestic worker looking after your kids right now, who's looking after theirs? And when the parents that are working in the cities are sending money home, it's often not enough to go around. Almost 90% of people live on less than $1.90 a day. And get this, it takes the average laborer an entire year to get what the average South African CEO earns in just 23 hours. In most parts of the world, families build wealth over generations by buying land and eventually building homes. But 5, black people have no land. So here's a quick timeline. 1652, the Dutch land. 1913, remember the date. The Native Land Act is born. Black South Africans are removed of their land and moved to the 7% of the country. 1948, racism and dividing races becomes official with apartheid. Separate schools, beaches, transport, hospitals, and definitely no interracial marriages. 1950, the Group Areas Act creates whites-only areas and forces thousands of people from their homes. 1970, now this is crazy. Black South Africans are effectively removed of their South African citizenship. 1994, Nelson Mandela becomes the first democratically elected South African president. Apartheid ends. But all of that land that was taken away from Black South Africans was never returned. And today, Black South Africans are 80% of the population, but have 1% of the land owned by individuals. Meanwhile, if you don't have a postcode or an address, it's really difficult to apply for social grants or even send your kids to a local school. And now you've got a native population that are basically squatting in their own country. Land is money, but Black South Africans are more broadly marginalized across the economy. But it's been 27 years since apartheid ended. Young Black South Africans can now educate themselves, work hard, and create a better life. But 6, the Bourne Freeze are not free. Bourne Freeze are the generation born after 1994, but yet over 70% of young South Africans are unemployed. And the biggest fight for that generation is for affordable education. They sparked the Fees Must Fall protests against university fee increases, highlighting the financial struggles of university students.
And we're creatively finding different ways on pushing the government to do what we want it to do, which is free education.
And even if they get an education and they make it, they've still got to deal with black tax and point 7, the sandwich effect. This is the idea that many young Black South Africans have to look after a generation above them, like their parents and grandparents, and a generation below them, like their siblings and children. This is also sometimes known as the black tax, and it can create a cycle of poverty where even if somebody's made it, they've got the burden of having to look after several generations around them. It doesn't sound fair, does it? 8. Humans are wired for fairness. As a species, we fight for equality and fairness. When you look at the world's happiest countries, they're often the most equal societies, as opposed to the saddest countries, which are often the most unequal. But there's many unequal countries, and this doesn't explain why South Africa is so violent. 9. South Africa was built on violence. Violence is what allowed a small minority of one racial demographic to rule over a majority during apartheid. The Sharpeville massacre, where 69 people, some of them children, were killed in a protest, is just one example of where militarized police were deployed to suppress civilian populations fighting for freedom. So there's a history of violence, plus present-day injustices around land, economics, education, making South Africa very complicated. But there is hope. 10. Solutions to inequality. Bill Gates says you should tax the rich and educate the marginalized, so every child has an equal opportunity to make it. And in South Africa, it's actually the middle class, bank tellers, retail workers that pay the majority of personal income tax. And yes, there's state capture, corruption, and all the rest, but a lot of good has also happened over the last 27 years with taxpayers' money. 3 million RDP houses have been built. It's not enough, but it's a start. Millions of people got access to water and electricity who didn't have it before democracy. And if people don't trust the government and corruption's the problem, experts say one of the best places to invest to fight inequality is good governance and leadership training. Empowering women is important too. And if you can't rely on national leadership to fix inequality, communities have to take responsibility for it themselves. This project encourages grandmas in their community to exchange litter for groceries. And this initiative took beggars off the streets and gave them jobs as gardeners. And in the township of Gugulethu, they're wine farming.
Tastes yummy.
Yum, yum.
These small projects are a start, but young Black South Africans that are living in poverty, like everyone, don't just want to survive, they want to thrive, to be the next CEOs and engineers. At the end, we have to start asking ourselves some difficult questions. How much do we pay the people that work for us? And could you survive on that wage? What kind of living conditions do those around you live in? What kind of a South Africa do we want our kids to grow up in? One with high walls and fences, or where everyone's equal and happy? Because as President Cyril Ramaphosa recently said,
inequality in our society is unsustainable.
And self-reflecting, am I successful in spite of or because of inequality?
Put a Finger Down South African Inequality Edition by #OurStories. Put a finger down if you give your family money every month. Put a finger down if you rely on public transport to get to work or school. Put a finger down if you took a student loan to pay for your education. Put a finger down if you don't have private health insurance. Put a finger down if you experience racism.
Thanks so much for watching. You can head over to the hashtag Our Stories Instagram or Snapchat account and try the inequality challenge. Don't forget to tag us. And if you've got 5 fingers up at the end, you're ready to grab at any opportunity in life. But if you end up with no fingers up, you may be fighting for your existence. This is hashtag Our Stories. What's yours?